Hey, welcome everybody. My name is Patrick Fry. I'm the CEO and founder of Venture Valuation. We also run this conference, Biotechgate Digital Partnering. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this very exciting panel we have today. So just very briefly, Biotechgate Digital Partnering, it's actually a partnering event. We started doing that during COVID, and the goal was really to provide a business development platform for people to connect. This is the 13th edition we've been doing. So we do 4 editions per year, and we get about 1,000 people that have signed up for the conference. And so it's really the goal is the partnering. So there's a lot of one-to-one meeting going on, and it's 24/7. So I checked, and it's really day and night people are doing partnering because we have about 60 countries that are participating. But we also have very exciting panels, and one we have today, and I'm very excited to have Pascal moderating this panel, and some very interesting participants who will talk about the value drivers and exit in women's health. I think we have one panelist who's not joined yet. Hopefully David will be able to make it, but I'm handing over to Pascal, and yeah, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Patrick. It's really exciting to do this panel. I think we have people from all over the world in this panel, from all continents pretty much. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, also from my end. I think it's clear that the interest in women's health and Femtech has grown tremendously over the last decades, but there is still a long, long way to go. And I think one of the drivers to actually keep getting more and more investments into the industry is exits. And this is what this panel will be all about. The agenda for this next hour will start with a short introduction by all the participants, all the panelists. Then Valentina will share a few slides to kind of kick this off with some data, big picture. Then I will start with some Q&A, and then we just open the floors for you. So I'm really looking forward to your questions as well. You can put your questions into the chat, and in the second part, we'll start addressing them. So let's make this really interactive. Yeah, and without further ado, I would like the panelists to directly introduce themselves. I think you will do that much better than if I would try to do it. And I would say we start with Erin.
Thank you, Pascal. Good evening from my side. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Erin Gainer. I have been involved in the women's health space for more than 20 years. Initially drug development, about a decade in drug development, in traditional pharmaceutical drug development, even pills, which may seem old-fashioned now. Running clinical trials and taking products through the FDA, through the EMA, in a range of women's health indications, from reproductive health contraception through to benign gynecological disorders to endocrinology and oncology. So that kind of breadth. And then the second sort of decade of my time in women's health has been more on the strategic side, as CEO of a women's health company, and then subsequently board member, chair of a variety of companies in the space. So delighted to share my variety of experience over the 2 decades with everyone.
Including an amazing exit, Erin, that you did, and we'll definitely talk about that later. Thanks so much. And maybe continuing with Colby.
Thank you so much for having me on the panel, Pascal, and good morning from California. Good evening to everyone around the globe. My background has always been in medical devices, medical technology. I started more in the cardiology, electrophysiology area, working for large companies here in the US, Medtronic, Guidant, et cetera, and then made a transition to smaller entrepreneurial companies in interventional cardiology, but pretty quickly realized that I wanted to be in different spaces, discovered women's health, and have had the amazing opportunity to work with a number of different companies over the past 10 or 12 years. And I started in an incontinence startup focused on fecal incontinence, women with bowel control problems, which was a really eye-opening entrance to women's health, to realize the conditions that are, not even addressed, problems that I wasn't even aware of, until you start doing the market research and really understanding the space. And then moved over to work with Alydia Health on the JADA system for postpartum hemorrhage, another problem that I was sadly unaware of until I began researching the company. Worked with that company through the sale to Organon 2 years ago. And now I'm still working with Organon, which is a biopharma life sciences company dedicated to women's health, looking to meet women's health needs across platforms. So I still am focused on the medical technology side, but we also have a big suite of pharmaceutical solutions for women that we're focused on. So it's a really amazing opportunity to look at women's health through a different lens, and now to spend time working with entrepreneurs from the strategic side.
Amazing, Colby. Thank you so much for being in this panel. And last but not least, handing over to you, Valentina.
Yeah, good evening from Zurich, and good morning to those of you on the other side of the globe. Really nice meeting you, and excited to be here with two fantastic panelists. I'm Valentina, I'm a partner with McKinsey. I've been with the company for 17 years by now, and I do the majority of my work in the life science space, which means pharma, but also public health. And I work on a range of topics and range of companies, from the large one to startups. And I'm very passionate about women's health. I co-lead our efforts in developing knowledge, raising awareness. And so very, very excited to discuss today, right, what comes next, and how to show the world that actually there is a lot of value in investing in women's health.
Thanks so much, Valentina. She published some of the really cool papers about femtech and women's health, and yeah, we're going to talk about that in a minute. Just maybe a few words about myself. So I also started my career at McKinsey 2 decades ago, and now in the last 15 years built a few digital health startups. The last one was in women's health, Femtec company that was acquired a year ago, a US company called Femtec Inc. I'm currently building a new startup in maternal health focused on Kenya. So really, really interesting to not only see that from the kind of rich world perspective, but also from a lower middle income perspective. And I'm also in the board chair of a company called Scailyte, which is very much involved in endometriosis. Yeah, I've seen a lot of ups and downs over the last 15 years in this space, and I'm really, really happy to moderate that and have you three experts in the panel. Patrick, looking at you, I think David has not joined so far. Is that correct? Just to make sure that I don't
yes, no, I
oversee him.
I haven't been able to reach him. I will try and see if he joins, but I think we'll just continue. We have an interesting panel anyway, so I think there's enough to talk about.
All right, great. I would say let's kick this off with some data. I think it's interesting to kind of have a top-down view. Valentina, if you could share a few slides to then kick off the discussion. Valentina, I think you're on mute.
So much for bragging that I always use a Zoom, no, Pascal? No. So, but thank you for your kind words. Let me start by saying, look, how do we define women's health? Because I think there is a lot also in how people think about it and how we conventionally have defined it. And I would say, look, I think nobody will object to it's something that has to do with being a woman and maybe your reproductive system, which is what I show at the bottom of this page. And I guess if we talk women's health, people say, of course, it has to do with contraception, fertility, right? Maternal health, whatever has to do with gynecological diseases, but also the women's cancer. So breast cancer, which is mainly, of course, prevalent in women, ovarian cancer, and so on. I mean, and that's, of course, an area that has been severely under-researched, except the cancers, I would say. But I'd like to think about it actually in more general terms, because there is a a lot of understanding or misunderstanding on the fact that, you know, we are not smaller men, right? We are a totally different entity compared to a man in the DNA. Each cell has a sex. And so we talk about it as diseases also that affect women differently, cardiovascular, and the typical example would be how a heart attack manifests itself in a woman compared to a man. Diseases that affect women disproportionately, and you can see the immune diseases, autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis, scleroderma, migraine, osteoporosis, they're much more prevalent in women, yet they get studied equally in men. And then there is a question around gender bias in care delivery. There are a lot of books talking about how, you know, pain is women with pain get, how can I say, discharged from hospitals. They get the care that they need necessarily, because there is a little bit of underlying bias on, oh, too much complaining, it must not be so bad. And then there is also, honestly, diseases for which we don't fully know how they affect differently men and women, like Alzheimer's, for example, because we also don't know enough about the diseases themselves. Now, from that, what's the bad news here is that, as I was saying, in general, where every angle we look at it, there has been a severe, how can I say, underinvestment in studying diseases that affect women, right? If you look at the 200 billion that we're spending 2020 in R&D in the pharma industry, you see that only out of all the assets in the clinical phase, only 1% actually are in diseases that are relevant for women. 4%, we get to 4% if we consider the cancers. Yeah, I mean, why? Hard to say, but it's probably because the mortality, right, the severity, the prevalence, you name it. But it's such a missed opportunity. When Pascal and I met, we were saying, look, endometriosis has a prevalence of 1 in 10 women. It's like diabetes, right? Why so little investment? And it's the same also if you look at MedTech in terms of these devices developed for women, but also NIH funding. And to the point I was making earlier, if you look at diseases that are more prevalent in women, it's funny how the NIH funding on specific studies doesn't match the prevalence, right, that of the population. Now, I don't want to be too gloom and doom, but the good news is that actually in the past few years with the advancements in digital, I would say also generational shift and women being more empowered and being also making 80% of the decisions in healthcare, we have seen many women taking more health in their hands and also more studies being done. So we see many more articles. We see an increased number of startups, right? And then we see a lot of funding going finally into women-related topic, in particular what we call Femtech. And probably all of you know, but Femtech is somehow a consumer-centric approach that is digitally enabled and focuses on, I would say, conditions that are more relevant for women. No? So on one side, great news, almost 2 billion funding. We see the UK, right, being front and center in Europe. We see unicorns popping up like the Maven Clinic. Yet to Pascal's point, maybe we haven't seen enough. If you think that this is almost 50% of the population in some areas, right, take menopause. Are we doing enough? Is the investment enough? And how do we attract more and how do we see more exits? Maybe I'll pause here for a second after talking for a long time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Valentina, for kicking this off. And I mean, yes, there is some good news. Clearly, the space is developing, and that is definitely nice. But at the same time, I think it's very, very clear that there is a huge potential, and there should be much more investments into that space. Maybe to kick this off, really, I mean, is it? I mean, you often hear, and I've experienced that myself, that the investment, many investors, the financial industry is very much male-driven, right? So how much is that actually part of the problem? Maybe kicking this off with you, Erin, Colby, like in your career, just of course this is anecdotal, but still, have you felt that it's actually tougher, A, being a woman, but B, also talking about women's health topics that are maybe not necessarily as close to to men as other topics?
I can start with that one. I would say the first part of the question, as a woman drug developer or executive, I don't think I've ever had any personal challenges, based on gender. I feel like, being educated sometimes I think being an American in the world of business in general is somehow an unfair advantage, because some kind of credibility goes along with that. I've been working in Europe much of my career. So I would say on the personal note, no, but when it comes to explaining, clinical indications or unmet needs to investors, even to your own advisors. And I remember in 2015, we were, getting ready for an IPO at HRA Pharma, my old company. We had hired a bunch of, our own investment bankers. We had our book runners. We had all of these bankers sitting around the table, and it was invariably 95%, men in the room. And so just the sort of time required to explain some very kind of simple things and some topics that can make people uncomfortable, talking about reproductive health and all of that. I do think that requires some additional effort on the side of the bankers or the advisors. And, it's not to say it's not possible to do it, but for whatever reason, there's that little extra energy required to get over the hurdle. And that being said, I would say as a woman executive leading that, it's sort of easier, probably, because you're somehow taken as being credible, you know what you're talking about, because it's some kind of women's condition, even though you're never necessarily been a patient in that particular field. Yeah, Colby, I don't know what your thoughts are.
I think the idea that education around women's health just requires that extra time, energy. It just puts a little more friction in the process, right? And I mentioned that when I started with the two women's health companies that I spent, 4 or 5 years with respectively, I didn't even know about those conditions myself, right? So then we're expecting investors to know and grapple with conditions that they've never heard of and that seem far-fetched. So when I say 1 in 10 women are going to have a bowel accident, they're like, that can't be right. How would I not know if women are having bowel accidents all around me all the time? That just seems crazy. We have market research, right? You have published literature on this subject, but it just feels so hard to believe when there's nothing in your lived experience that matches up to that. So, really does help to have investors who are seeking the opportunity to invest in women's health issues and who are, looking to make a difference. Because I would say over the past 5 to 10 years, there's been this sort of springing up of new funds and new groups, or within large established groups, individuals who are very interested in seeking out women's health problems. And that makes the discussion so much easier, to Erin's point. And when you then have the next stage is that you have to say, okay, well, we have this insert and it's going to sit, you have to place it transvaginally, and you have to get everybody comfortable with saying the anatomical words out loud. It's just more friction. But I think that it also sits in a very realistic investor context where they're saying, well, show me the comps, where are the other women's health exits that have happened? And again, I think we're in a better position now than we were when I started in this space 10 years ago, thanks in part to the work, done by folks on this panel and others, to have more exits and more investments. But, investors are, despite the sort of venture in venture capital, they are not necessarily risk seeking, right? They're looking for returns. They're looking for a story that can help them get comfortable with the investments they're making with their own LP's money, and they're investing other people's money. They have to be able to tell the story. So it's a full ecosystem of comfort that I think has been lacking in women's health, that hopefully we're beginning to address by there being more open dialogue about the conditions, more examples of success, and this feeds into itself.
Amazing, and we're going to talk about comps, about successful exits in a minute. But yeah, Valentina, I would love to hear. I mean, you're talking to C-level of many of the big pharma, MedTech companies, probably also rather male-dominated, not dominated. Like, how do you experience that?
Listen, I think I love what Colby and Erin were saying. I think indeed there is a slowly progress, I would say, into understanding more these diseases. But even before understanding, having more awareness that there are conditions that have always been given as is a fact of life. Take PMS, take menopause, right? It was like, just deal with it. Every woman, right, goes through it. And so what's the big deal? And I feel we are on a journey where overall, even women, right, are improving their own understanding and awareness that some of the symptoms they might be experiencing are not normal, and they should not cope with them necessarily. What I do see, I wanted to say a positive note on a conversation I had recently, for example, with a private equity investor. And it was about menopause, and they were interested in a company. And so I was trying to give a little bit of perspective also on prevalence and what does it mean to go through menopause. And look, they were all men, and they told me, tell me again the numbers, 29 million women in the US, and all of them are gonna need something like this. Why are people not investing? Explain that to me again, which was very enlightening, right? Because it was, I tell you, a group of men, and they were like, this is such a clear opportunity. So I think there is an element to, look, awareness is getting there, showing the numbers, right? Yes, we don't have enough exits yet, but somehow I feel in some areas we are probably moving in the right directions. There are other areas that maybe might be more prone to bias. Take endometriosis is very hard, right? The science is unclear, and we need much more effort even to understand the biology before we can have a truly transformative solution. And so to your point, Pascal, the executive, then become a little bit skeptical. Where can they show successful outcomes, right? It's not even a question of exit, but, there has been no success story in some of these areas. And so some of the fears I feel are like the push on R&D productivity, right? How do we invest more in an area where we couldn't find a solution,
Great, thanks so much. And I would love to talk about now the success cases and really learn from what you have done, Erin and Colby, over this last decade. Maybe starting with you, Erin, HRA Pharma. You sold the company when you were the CEO. I think it was in 2015 to two big private equity companies. So I would love to hear more about that. Was that kind of always your strategy? Was it just more opportunistic that you got asked? Tell us more. Like how did this exit happen?
Right. So just a couple of words of background on the company for those who are not familiar with HRA Pharma. So we were founded in the late 90s. Again, a time of consolidation in the traditional women's health pharma space, in the 90s, and a lot of the traditional players in women's health had kind of fallen out of the area or were no longer investing at all. And so the premise of HRA was to say, let's develop medicines for the most part that respond to unmet needs in women's healthcare. It seems fairly straightforward. And we were founded on really a very niche market, which is emergency contraception or postcoital contraception, with the idea that this was something that had been done for years. Doctors or women were cutting up pill packs and using, certain combinations of combined oral contraceptives within, the few 72 hours or so after unprotected sex, and using that to prevent pregnancy before it started. So here I've already used a lot of words that can make people uncomfortable. You can see in even just the background of the company. But we started out and managed, thanks to some really clever drug development, to develop an emergency contraceptive based on a well-established and well-characterized hormonal agent that was not estrogen, so just a progestin, with a great safety, track record, and to use a lot of published literature. The World Health Organization had invested a lot in that space, and to leverage that with some very targeted studies, some very professional drug development on the manufacturing side, but a really clever clinical development strategy, and to bring something to market rather quickly. And that always, I think, once you have proven that you are able to develop something and take it through regulatory approval, that's already a huge plus, in any of our let's say, fundraising or exit strategies, because I see exit as just another way to raise funds for a business. So fast forward, we had already a commercial presence. We were cash flow positive. We were growing rapidly, and when I took, I started working with the founding team very early on. And when I took over as CEO in 2011, or actually I took over in 2009, we went through a first round of growth capital raising. So that was already, let's say, a mini exit. Some of the seed funders and some of the institutional funders that had come on board to kind of back the founding team were interested in investing. So we had a first round of, really roadshows, hiring investment bank, talking to potential investors and getting a good sense of the reaction of growth capital investors to a business like ours. Again, women's health, contraception, slightly controversial contraception. And so one of my takeaways then, which was the same case in 2015-16 when we exited, is that when it's a pure financial investor, it's a lot more work for the management team versus a strategic, because you're not just explaining your market, but you're explaining your industry and the mechanics of, your distribution and your manufacturing and all of that. So I think that, round of fundraising ended up being successful. We brought in a small cap focused private equity fund, international fund, and it really coincided with what we wanted. We wanted capital to grow internationally. And so, and they were sort of intrigued by the healthcare space, didn't have a lot of knowledge. And so it was, a kind of a nice match for us. And so they invested in 2011. So come around 15-16, of course, one of the big reasons that we end up exiting in general is when investors are interested in moving on. We also had continued to grow, had made acquisitions, we're growing very nicely. And began to look seriously at an IPO, as I mentioned earlier. And as part of that, and I can say why an IPO as opposed to private equity sale as the initial strategy. We really felt like we had this unique positioning, this unique track record, this unique focus that was sort of best suited for, let's say, the public markets in terms of ensuring long-term sustainability, as opposed to what you can get, in more financial investor scenario where the focus can be more short term. So we were on that track, getting some good leverage when we were approached by private equity. And ultimately, it seemed, I think, a bit more comfortable for some of our founding investors to go that way. The private equity funds were very, very eager to help us continue our growth. Again, because we were profitable and growing, it was a candidate, let's say, for leverage buyout to a certain extent. And yeah, so that was, we concluded that transaction in 2016. For me, honestly, as an executive at the time, and, partial owner, what was clear is that with the private equity ownership, our focus would probably become more market driven and more, value creation driven, as opposed to women's health focus, which was really my passion. So, I was fortunate enough to take that opportunity to step into a board role and let that transition happen quite smoothly. And then another exit, a very successful exit last year. The business was then sold to a strategic, to Perrigo, and had basically been transformed over the time from kind of women's health into consumer health, with still a strong women's health focus, but a consumer health angle. And that's just one last comment I make. I've been talking for a while. I do think there are two ways to view women's health or women's health businesses. You can see women as the patients, or you can see women as the consumers, or both. But if you see women as consumers, we know that women take care of purchasing health services, health products, predominantly in their family or in their relationship. Women as healthcare consumers are a very significant market. And that was sort of interestingly the direction that HRA Pharma kind of went. We went from more focused on women's health endocrinology from a clinical point of view to really being focused on consumer health and adding in some brands through acquisition, like Mederma, the scar healing products. They're not exclusively for women. Compeed, the blister product, everybody knows. We actually acquired that, interestingly, from J&J, and really added another big leg to the business, seeing again the woman consumer as the focus, and having a basket of brands to offer to our consumers. And that's why ultimately, our final acquisition last year was Perrigo, which is a consumer health focused business. They are very excited to continue the women's health aspect, and we are excited to see them do that with a landmark OTC approval that just came through the FDA for an oral contraceptive pill. That's a project we had started over a decade ago. So it's thrilling to see that carry on, and we're all hopeful that they will continue to carry the torch of the women's health business moving forward.
So amazing, and one of the big success cases in this space. So yeah, huge high five, Erin, and everybody was involved there. That's cool, and I would have many follow-up questions. Maybe we have time for that. But I would like to pass to Colby and kind of hear from her. You sold Alydia, or you were one of the drivers of selling Alydia to Organon. How strategic was that? Like, did you also look at private equity or even an IPO? I'm not sure whether that was an option at the time, or yeah, how much opportunistic was it versus that you planned that from the beginning?
Yeah, great question. And to answer just a little bit of context on Alydia as a company. So the company was founded in 2011 by two students at Cal Poly University here in California, who came up with this idea for vacuum-induced hemorrhage control. And this is the idea that after a baby is delivered, the placenta comes out, and then the uterus needs to contract to control bleeding. So the muscle is tired, it needs to tighten up in order to constrict all the blood vessels. And that usually happens naturally, but sometimes doesn't. And then pharmaceutical agents can be used to induce that contraction. If that doesn't work, there was a mechanical option that was a balloon used to, inflate against the uterine walls. And that was the only real mechanical device option. And then you're going to surgical options, including hysterectomy, which is removal of the uterus. And in the scenarios where hemorrhage becomes uncontrolled, it can obviously be very scary, life-threatening, require transfusion, massive transfusion, ICU stay, et cetera. So something you want to control as early as possible. So to study the device that the students had come up with, which was the idea of using vacuum to encourage that natural contraction of the uterus, they had spent, several years doing feasibility work, bench work, had gone to Indonesia to do a first-in-woman study in 10 patients, and then had come to the US to work on a clearance, and that clearance required 100 plus patient study to be submitted in order to submit to FDA. So when I joined the company in 2018, there was already 7 years of work gone into sort of feasibility, proving the concept. And then we had this big milestone ahead of us with the clinical study. And at that point, the company had done a great job of getting to know some of the players in women's health. We had a number of grant funding relationships, and had a Series B on board in 2018 when I joined, and had been talking to some strategics all along. And I think that's an important takeaway for any entrepreneur, is from the early days, be in touch with the strategics who might be interested in your technology down the road, build those relationships, walk them through your milestones, even though it's too early, give them a heads up as to where you're going. So there was sort of some awareness and relationships at that point. And then when we finished the clinical study, we certainly did not expect that a sale was a given at that time. So we had raised a Series C just at the end of the clinical study in order to get through the FDA clearance and the early launch. And we were not sure if it was the right time for a sale, or if we would be raising a Series D to do the sort of the bigger first commercial couple years on our own. And certainly there's pros and cons to both approaches. And often strategics are not necessarily interested in an acquisition ahead of seeing a few years of commercial experience. And so there was definitely an opportunistic angle here in terms of getting our clinical results back, and the outcomes for the study were so positive. It was a great story. So we were able to point to the overwhelming success of the study, of the device, and how it performed. And then we were also able to tell a great commercial story. So, one of the things I learned in a prior company is, of course, how important the story of reimbursement is. And with the JADA system, we didn't need to go out and develop new coding, develop new payments, because childbirth is reimbursed as a bundle in the United States. You're really asking hospitals to make a budget trade-off. Does this device, offset some of your other costs? Do you believe that that's going to fund your purchase of the device? They can make that decision without waiting for payers to get on board, or Medicare to get on board, Medicaid. So I think we had this sort of combination of saying, we have great data, we're ready to go to market with great data, and we don't have a long reimbursement pathway. So the first 3 months of sales that we had as we were having conversations with strategics was kind of enough evidence to get companies really excited. And then the true opportunistic thing that happened is that Organon spun out of Merck. And so that company, Organon, had not even existed when the company began. We did have a relationship with Merck for Mothers, which was a nonprofit arm within Merck that funds work around maternal mortality. But those were sort of different players. We had the chance to connect with some folks from Organon just as our pivotal study data was coming out, and share it with them, and they were really intrigued, as were some of the other groups that we had been in touch with. And that was what gave us the confidence to start, hire bankers to start a process. At the same time, we were talking to investors around the Series D, and the board is strongly considering, which of these pathways is going to be the best for investor returns, but also for the future of the therapy. We had social impact investors on our board who were very interested in ensuring that this technology made it to women, not just in the United States, but in low middle income countries all around the world. So all of those thoughts were sort of present in the decision making around what was the right next home for the device at that point. It was a really exciting, thoughtful, and inspiring process to sort of see the recognition of the potential for the therapy.
So you got an offer basically from Organon during that time when you were thinking about the Series B. Did you then kind of launch a bigger process and kind of get an investment banker on board to kind of talk to all MedTech or healthcare companies around the world? Or did you say, no, actually Organon is the best?
Yeah, I should say it wasn't that an offer came from Organon first, preceding a process. We started a process sort of recognizing that there were a number of parties that were interested, and then a number of parties participated in that process.
Super cool. Amazing. Yeah. Valentina, if you talk to the big MedTech pharma companies, like how do they think about kind of acquisitions from the other end? Is that something that is basically their innovation strategy because they are too slow or too expensive to do that inside? Is it just a small part for them? When is the right time for them? Actually, Colby just mentioned that, they would like to see as much clinical and even commercial data as possible. Like, tell us the perspective of the big ones.
Yeah, and let me say, unfortunately, Organon is almost a unique company, right, that has been spun off from Merck to be focused purely on women's health, right? We have a few more like Ferring that is focused on fertility or postpartum hemorrhage and a few other areas. But unfortunately, today there is a handful of pharmaceutical companies that focus on women's health. There are some that maybe have more the HRT for menopause, right? Not much innovation there. And so when you talk women's health, Pascal, honestly, with the large pharmacos maybe that I work with, their focus goes immediately to oncology, right? And cancer-related therapies or rare diseases, because this is where they have been able to provide disproportionately positive outcomes through science, yeah, I would say. So is women's health top of mind? Not really, right? I see now some taking more the approach of, because immunology is a very interesting area, is another of these areas that scientifically it's slightly, I don't want to say it's easy, but it's maybe easier to understand than others. They're making inroads in developing multiple sclerosis or, Sjogren's disease, which is majority women. And so they're going more, not so much on the women's only conditions, but more into this broader category that I was describing. And they go also to the question that some of the colleagues are asking in the chat. I would say, what's the reasoning there? There is a question on what's the unmet medical need out there, right? Do we have anything that works? Can I provide a solution that is really going to be transformative and differential, right? Otherwise, they're not going to invest, And also, what's the alternative? Because somebody's saying, look, I've made investors, they don't understand this, or maybe they don't understand, do I need to show prevalence and data? I think there is indeed a question of show exactly what's the need you're going to address, how much it's going to cost to get there, but also what's the alternatives that exist and why your solution is superior, right? And that's what I see pharma companies doing, and that's how they decide to place their bet.
How much is actually the issue that, I mean, if you talk about oncology, if you have a cancer, you can die, right? Many of the women's health conditions, you don't necessarily die, right? PMS or menopause or endometriosis, PCOS, other stuff, right? I mean, this can really make your life miserable. I guess, obviously not knowing myself, but from all I hear, but it's not probably typically deadly. Do you think that plays a role here? That men say, well, you have your menopause issues, but so what? Or like, how do you see that?
Let me say, can I, Erin, you want to go first? Go first. To me, there is a combination of two things. One, yes, indeed, I think is underplayed entirely as in terms of the impact. And even if you look at the DALI, let's say, they're not so disaggregated for some of these conditions. They don't even pop up, but it's severely underestimated. And then I think, look, now it's easy to talk cancer, but there has been so much investment, right? And so also the fact that people didn't talk about some of these conditions has also, in my mind, triggered that lack of funding, right? That has not allowed to understand exactly the biology of women, right? If I oversimplify. Last year I spoke to the top key opinion leader in breast cancer in Switzerland, and he started by saying, let me tell you, the women are so difficult to understand because all the hormones, and he didn't mean it in a bad way, but that's the situation, right? People don't know, right? A lot of the biology underlying these processes, and there needs to be more effort to do that so that we can find, I think, solutions. Erin, sorry,
No, not at all. Sorry, you were speaking. I think the menopause or post, if you want to say, hormone replacement therapy story is quite interesting, and perhaps there are some important lessons. I mean, if you think it's already 20 years, since the Women's Health Initiative sort of fiasco came out, where there was a very non-patient driven approach to hormone replacement therapy, which was to say, let's blanketly give everybody the same thing, regardless of clinical symptoms, regardless of any other underlying disorders, and let's give it to a whole lot of people and then see what happens. And of course, then the results were, some argue, overinterpreted in the opposite direction. And then, and I think there's some data now suggesting that some of the cognitive issues that we see in aging women is because they were ripped off hormone replacement therapy, and then switched to something else. So that being said, at the time, HRT was a massive business. And, Wyeth, whatever, subsequently Pfizer, they were all doing a lot of business in the space and making a lot of money and being, quite successful. I think one thing that happened is the traditional women's health markets like HRT or contraception became genericized. And so the value went down a lot. The value of investing in innovation in those areas was suddenly perceived as lacking because there were just, so many generic options out there. And then, as I said, the perhaps lack of patient-driven clinical research was sort of relevant to that. So I do think, what we're seeing in some of the data you showed, Valentina, in terms of women in engagement in clinical trials, the way you're seeing now the protocols that are being developed, even just for HRT, using existing agents, are much more promising. And I kind of don't buy that something that's chronic and affects people is not a good business. I mean, diabetes, all of these things, chronic diseases are massive businesses from a public health point of view, from a business point of view. I think there's a lot of opportunity, but yes, you have to frame it in the right way, and you have to find people willing to take the risk to invest in some research and do it properly.
I think you hit a nerve, Pascal, because all three of us were eager to jump in on that question. But certainly, many large industries have been built around non-life-threatening conditions. Orthopedic surgery as a concept, which has driven, huge segments of medical devices. BPH, the first word in BPH is benign, right? And these are important conditions for us to address, but we should be able to sort of think of pelvic floor reconstruction or menopause as similar inevitable conditions that human beings will face, that we have the science and technology to address to make life better, and therefore we should, in a way that positively impacts the whole population, not just certain segments, and doesn't exclude certain segments. So certainly feel very strongly that there should be a strong business case to improve the lives of women the same way we attempt to improve the lives of men. And I would also, put a pause on that and then build on what Erin was commenting around HRT, that there has been this unfortunate trend in women's health where we find a promising business, we dive in very aggressively, and then we find out that we went too far, or the technology had unintended consequences, or the pharmaceutical agent had non-understood side effects, and we pull all the way back, shut down the entire business, take it away from women, no choice. And it's a very overreactive sort of pattern that we have, and that's been very detrimental to the women's health industry. If you look at pelvic floor mesh, if you look at morcellation, and then HRT, all of these were promising technologies that brought a lot of value to many patients. Some patients had bad outcomes, and that needs to be addressed, and we need to do better. But we've had such a strong reaction to pull all the way back from some of these investments, and there's got to be a way to meet the needs of women without taking options away.
Amazing. And I mean, clearly, I think all three of you kind of killed the argument that just if something is not deadly, that it doesn't make sense to kind of invest there. So
can I
cool.
quote another thing, Pascal, because on this topic we were researching somehow endometriosis or this type of diseases, they affect women in a special period of life, let's say in the 20-30s. You should see the number of Google searches on this topic is much higher than breast cancer or ovarian cancer, right? So it's very top of mind for women, but it's not reflective of the efforts that are going into research, right? Or even the medical practice, I would say.
Amazing. I hope there are some investors here in the panel. So yeah, I think this message is quite clear that many super interesting business opportunities, and it's actually proven with many of the examples you did. One of the questions in the chat was about geographic focus. How is culture different in different geographies? Clearly in contraception, for instance, there seems to be a big difference. Maybe Erin can tell us more about that, but also maybe Colby, how you see like postpartum bleeding, even the discussion about it being different in different geographies. I think it's interesting to have a chat about that, and then also maybe bringing it back to our topic, kind of exits. It seems that most of the exits are really at the end very much driven by the US, the US market on one hand, but also US investors. Also looking eventually at the two exits of you, Erin and Colby. Yeah, can you tell us a bit more about how you think about different geographies? Should you just focus on the US because that's where the exit is going to come from, or I mean, hopefully not, but from a pure financial or economic reason, yeah, how do you see that?
I can start. I think obviously the global, there's a couple layers where you're asking. One is, will our technology be used differently in different cultures? And, the answer is yes, because the practice around childbirth is quite different around the world. The US has we like to schedule birth here. We have a high rate of inductions, a rate of elective C-sections that, we'd still like to work on, but is not excessive. But we like to have it scheduled, where in Europe there may be more midwife-led birth, more use of birthing centers, that allows for more flexible timing. Where in Brazil, 80% of deliveries are by C-section. So there's so many different cultural differences around the practice of childbirth that then impact how postpartum hemorrhage presents and how it's managed. Obviously, it's managed differently in a surgical suite than in a birthing center than in a hospital labor and delivery unit. So a lot of different considerations there. And you need to take that into account as you build your global plans. From the time that we were talking about acquisition with Organon, we were so early, even in the US market, that it was kind of enough for us to go into great detail about the US market and how growth would occur there. And then only at a higher level address the prevalence of postpartum hemorrhage, birth rates, et cetera, around the world, without doing a deep dive on other geographies. And we knew that those geographies are going to be a little later for us in launching anyway, based on how small the company was at the time. So not to say that the US is the most important market, it's just the market that we were in, and where we spent the most time and diligence.
I think I can echo what you said in terms of, yes, there are differences in practice in, on the reproductive health side, in terms of contraception, in terms of, perception of, for example, sterilization. In the US, it's not uncommon to have a vasectomy or other surgical sterilization, whereas in many European contexts, it's like, no way. So, there are cultural differences. I think one thing I would highlight is, in my experience, there are a lot of fantastic researchers around the world, not in the US, that are very engaged with their patients, that may even be more interested than, on let's say the average, that I would really encourage engaging with research groups, with clinicians, with practitioners, across different geographies, not just to capture this range of practice, but to also really harness their energy and expertise. That being said, the US market is, from an investor point of view, we're talking about exit. The US market is the what everybody is after, because price points are still that much higher than everywhere else. Just the pure value opportunity is, in my experience, is definitely US driven. It doesn't mean that you can't have a nice exit without a US presence. Our 2016 transaction, we were barely in the US, I can say, and we still had enough business elsewhere, to be quite an attractive investment opportunity. But the most recent one, of course, was, clearly, I think the value was such, or the price ambition was such, that the US market was absolutely critical in that. And I think doesn't seem like it's going to change. Maybe now, Medicare reimbursement negotiations might impact that a little bit in the US, but as far as I can tell, for the big exits, the US is key. It doesn't have to be there for the growth and the growth strategy, but for the big ones, my view is that you need the US.
We have still a lot of questions. I think more than 10 questions in the chat that are unanswered, and that's a bit frustrating. I'm really sorry that we don't have time for addressing them properly. I think a few we touched upon. We have 3 more minutes, and I would like to finalize this. Maybe if you all take 1 minute or so. We have a lot of entrepreneurs, startups, scale-ups in the women's health space in this panel. Kind of, what would be the 3 tips or the 1-2 tips that you would give them in terms of what they should do to prepare a potential exit in the future. I'm not sure who wants to kind of take this first. Valentina, you're always the fast thinker, the others as well, but yeah, maybe you.
Look, that's a challenging one. They did it, right? So I think their view will be more important. In my mind, I think at times really the clarity on the value proposition, right? What is the solution that you're developing? Why is it differentiated? What is the impact that it's gonna have, right? It probably can move the needle in terms of attracting investments, right? And so probably getting some coaching on how to be very clear, right? And also scouting and understanding the competitive landscape. And I like a lot, Colby and Erin, what you said, somehow understanding the mechanisms. How is it going to be reimbursed? Because the idea could be great, but then there are many technical, let's say, or potentially challenges. So understanding end-to-end how the solution fits into the delivery of healthcare.
Amazing. Colby?
Yeah, I strongly agree with that point that you have to be able to articulate the value proposition from very early on, and then all of your decisions need to sort of feed into that. So as you're thinking about your FDA pathway, you have the indications that you're going for, you know, what claims you're hoping to take out of the clinical study. All of these need to tie back to that ultimate value proposition and how you're positioning yourself for reimbursement, if that's needed or not. And it's easy to sort of say, oh, I'll think about reimbursement later and kind of push that down the road. But it's really critical to develop that thinking early on and then be able to clearly articulate that at every stage of your fundraising process, all the way through to strategic sale.
I think I would just add in the same vein. I mean, you know, we are a science-driven industry, and I would say, first of all, the science has to be rock solid. Whatever you are claiming, whatever the you know, presumed or proven mechanism of what you are developing, I would say it really has to be solid. And that would be, you know, the thing that you can always fall back on in terms of these discussions. Sorry, I have a future women's health consumer here who's eager to wrap up. The other thing is, I think patience, you know, patience with the diligence, patience with explaining things 1,000 times. You know, it does require the calendar. And the equity story, you know, it needs to be, regardless of the exit, for me, the investment is just the next stage in the business. So what will you do if you're raising funds, if you're changing hands, you know, where do you see the business going ultimately? And that's going to survive whatever the next change in shareholders is, if the value proposition is compelling. So just, yeah, stick to the vision and that patience.
So cool. A huge thank you to all three of you. It was really, really nice to learn from you. Thank you so much for making that. And a big thank you also to the participants. We have now, I think, more people in the room than after 10 minutes, which is not something you see so often. So it seems that yeah, the contents were really yeah, being welcomed. So a huge thank you to everybody.